It had indeed been a most unusual experience for someone like me, because I would normally never step on ice, and yet it seemed I had done just that. Indeed, it had been one of the worst periods of my life, wasting time with someone believing himself to be the only authority to command everybody as he pleased. In those very vulnerable times, I was listening to some trusted friend's advice to consider the opportunity which might lead to a positive outcome. It would have been far better if I had listened to the warning signals. It was obvious that many of Damon's associates were taking advantage of him, seemingly accepting all his dictates for reasons known only to them. Remember, he was wealthy. He might thus have considered me as yet another candidate to command and lord it over. On the other hand, he did not know any better, for it was his way of helping others. I've seen him treat people like elements of life unworthy to do business with, for they were dishonest towards his imagined greatness, himself being overly elite, highly intelligent, and having plenty of buying power. But let us also remember that the fragrance always stays in the hand that gives the rose. It is like giving, yet demanding its immediate return. When I was a youth, I was subjected to so many promises, especially by those who also considered themselves as God's chosen, and the witnesses, preaching about righteousness before the end times. Although befriended with them, for they apparently sought peace in the world, I could not correlate this with their biased viewpoints. Perhaps I was very young and inexperienced. My relatives and some friends thought that I was following their teachings due to my association with them. In fact, I was seeking ways to escape from a lifelong situation which was likely to develop. I am grateful for their unexpected and generous help in accommodating me when I traveled to Germany, primarily to educate myself and work at the same time. That was where I met my future partner, whom I loved so dearly, and who, shortly after, got baptized into her divine associate's faith. It was extremely hard to follow the norm and endless restrictions they adhered to. Frankly, I could not understand the logic behind not celebrating socially accepted and beautiful events which the world enjoyed, such as Christmas and birthdays, nor could I accept their rejection of life-giving treatments to their loved ones and children in hospital, where they meant to become sacrificial offerings. I tried hard to understand them, but studying medicine at one of the prominent universities in Europe showed me more important truths, highlighting that their way could be no more than a utopian or even cultist idealism. I left Turkey because I was no longer able to tolerate the bullying, undermining, and belittling attitudes of the locals against the race I belonged to. Despite all the desires of my father and some other relatives, I could not see any future for myself in that country. After thorough research, discovery, and wise advice from those who had suffered much during the 1915s and had ever since been considered as unworthy individuals, even to be called human, all opportunities denied for any of them to excel, it left me no other choice. Incredibly, during an interview in regard to a possible conscription service, as expected of their citizens, a high-ranking military officer made mention of this condition, advising me to make use of the opportunities overseas to educate myself. Even then, when I was still a mere youth, I decided not to follow the crowd. Alan Ashley Pitt writes, "The man who follows the crowd will usually get no further than the crowd. The man who walks alone is likely to find himself in places no one has ever been." When I decided never to return to that country, it was because of my inability to accept people's attitude towards me and others for being Armenian, let alone the embarrassment one had to endure. I was an odd man out. To be able to live there reasonably comfortably, as it had been the case for many decades, an Armenian needed to change his identity, his belief, and live a life of lies. Even today, after such drastic changes, they still live in fear of being discovered as to what they originally are, for fear of ridicule, persecution, and endless punishments born of historic hatred. They are seen as unwanted criminals, just for being Armenians. I simply had enough of being laughed at as if I belonged to an extraterrestrial alien race. Alas, after leaving their homeland, I was not able to see my parents throughout the ensuing years, not even when they grew old and passed on. Life had taken me into different directions. I got married, had children, and created a life for myself in Australia, where I have not been discriminated against as a member of some minority group, but accepted as someone who belonged to the human race. I am an Australian citizen. The other language I was able to speak during my childhood days is long forgotten, and only fragments are remembered. After the divorce from my ex-partner, who still follows the pathways of the only righteous ones she believes in, and the chosen, I could never wish what I experienced happen to any human being. This unacceptable adventure I had undertaken with Damon had been one of the most devastating experiences to endure. As one can appreciate, I desperately needed a long while on my own to rediscover and to reinvent myself. Euripides, the great thinker, once declared, "Along with success comes a reputation for wisdom." Damon spoke of success all the time, but wisdom was absent. After all the ugly times I had experienced with him, I ardently wished that he would leave me alone for a considerable time, and forever would be even better. Knowing his nature well by now, I became extremely apprehensive in answering incoming phone calls, the same as opening my door when someone knocked. I was living in fear. It was an unusual and very strange sense of worry I could do without. This meant that I preferred people to leave messages so that I could respond to them in my own time. However, when Damon returned about a week later, he could not wait until he called me with his usual rough and threatening mannerisms, remembering that I had clearly told him that I needed at least a month to relax my mind. I avoided responding to his demands. I was also aware of his relentless characteristics of never respecting such a request. Was it due to him considering himself to be the most special individual, charming, intelligent, and wealthy? During this time, I was still conducting tailored meditation sessions at some friend's dwelling. Although he had attended some of those programs previously, he could never relax, always fidgeting with his hands, occasionally puffing. He was always bored when subjected to relaxation meditations. Remaining still was most certainly impossible for him, even when it required just 20 minutes of his time. As he later complained, those minutes were like hell and very boring. He preferred to relax with his other associates, smoking his herbs and gossiping about things. Obviously, the experience of meditation was too unusual for him. Later, he said that he did not feel comfortable with those old people around him. Yet they were not very old at all. He repeatedly told me to get rid of all those old arseholes and start a new meditation group with his chosen friends and associates. His aim was to make lots of money through those sessions. He continually, bitterly complained about my outgoing messages, where I ended my words with, "Smile and be happy." His last 2 messages were particularly interesting, because he was again threatening me. "Professore, we must meet very, very soon, or otherwise things will go very nasty." I knew how angry he was when things did not go his way, and his eyes looked as if he was an outraged primitive with murderous intentions. One could not be certain whether he was bluffing or was very serious. To tell you the truth, I could not interpret his behavior any other way. Nearly 3 weeks later, while I was conducting one of my regular meditation sessions at Doreen and Jerry's, I had to endure yet another frantic episode of Damon's personal ills. That evening, after we had finished the session, and while enjoying light snacks, 2 members of the group immediately rushed in after being outside briefly, warning us to hide Suren, or whisk him away from behind their dwelling, for they had seen Damon parked in his Mercedes and putting a gun in his pocket. Joan asked me to get into her car quickly, and we left. The next morning, the friends who were initially gathered there told me all about the last night's incident. They had noticed him parked on the roadside and seen the gun he was carrying. Probably he had obtained it when visiting Los Angeles. When he drew up to the close, he approached Rosemary, who was sitting in her car, insistently demanding to see Suren, and she told him that I had left. Rosemary explained later that when she asked him why he so urgently wanted to see Suren, he told her, while pulling one of his lower eyelids and asking her to look deep into his eyes, according to his traditions, to indicate he was not bluffing, that he came to kill him. When Joan was driving in a hurry, she told me to hide quickly, for Damon was driving next to her at one stage. In truth, I had never experienced something like this before, and was petrified. The next day, Rosemary and I furnished a legal document for the police to obtain a restriction order to be served on Damon, so that by law he could not disturb me any longer. He dared not approach me directly or by phone. Many weeks passed without him bothering any of us. Just as I was thinking that he might have got the point, he was on the phone, somewhat calmed, asking me to meet him. Apprehensively at first, I asked him, point blank, whether he wanted to kill me. "No, Professore, I didn't mean it that way. I only wanted to say I was very serious about our friendship, like brothers, you know," was his response. I could never trust anybody with such primitive behavior, and told him what I thought, explaining that I set my own rules, and was not obliged to meet him. Therefore I needed some time before I was ready to consider his request. A short while later, over the phone, one could hear him say he regretted his bullying behavior, promising that this sort of thing would never happen again. But even if I decided to meet him, I could no longer trust him. Taking note of his promises and believing that there may be some human aspect of good which could be found in his person, I decided to see him at one of the Chapel Street restaurants in Suren. But I was going to see him only with another friend and possibly in police presence. Again, Rosemary volunteered to accompany me. I was told that I should not be so compassionate, but my courage was commendable in deciding to go and see a man who had threatened to kill me. When having met him at Café Siena, talking about his usual concerns and personal issues, Rosemary decided to leave us alone for a short while. We had a light meal, which he decided to pay for, and told me how frightened he was when the police delivered the restriction order to his address. He was frightened, for he did not want to be found guilty for what he possessed. After discovering that I was not so easily broken, he exclaimed that I had the balls of steel. I told him about how I felt in regard to his bullying and threats. Even the mildest occurrence of such kind would mean he would never be able to see me again. Noticing I was not frightened of him at all, he changed his story a little, telling me how frustrated he was not seeing me for such a long time, but he just wanted to scare me a little at the time, and now he knew it would not work with me. He was apparently very serious with his alleged generous friendship, without any strings attached. That was most certainly not believable, as far as I was concerned. Then he exclaimed how sad he felt that I lived in Springvale, in that awful state, in an awful place. He was going to get me a house somewhere in St. Kilda, and I could pay him whenever I had some income, slowly but regularly. At the end of the day, the house would become mine. He even asked me if I wanted to live at my previous dwelling, which I had to sell to survive once, but I did not want to live with unwanted memories of the past. He demanded that I should decide very soon, if possible, then and there. I clearly told him that I needed to think about it, although I knew he was not happy with this. When I left him and went home with Rosemary, she told me that if she had known what kind of man he was, she would most certainly have attempted to stop me going overseas with him, for she noticed how I looked when discovering that I was to travel with him, like a lamb going to the slaughter. Joan suggested, in regard to what Damon was intending to do, one would not know what good could come out of it. Since Damon was probably a changed man, she advised me to accept his offer, although Rosemary was against it. I had no one to turn to. Joan, with her family, and Rosemary were the only people I could talk to about anything, including my dilemmas. They were the only people who listened to what I said and cared about me as a human being. According to Joan and her family's philosophical viewpoints, I had nothing to lose. Maybe I should have completed that sentence with, "except my life." We started a meditation program at Damon's place for his personal spiritual needs, wherein he expected me to do some private channeling to his spirit friends and guides who were allegedly helping him with his financial success. He rarely invited his other associates and bitterly complained about Rosemary being a little too forthright for his liking. Speaking liberally about this issue, he often exclaimed how frightened he was when the police delivered the restriction order on him. He obviously had a number of reasons to feel that way, while advising me to get rid of all those arseholes, sharing my meditation activities so that we could start a brand new one with his own associates. On occasions, whenever we traveled together, he pointed at certain people on Chapel Street, talking about their gang-related self-employment issues. They had apparently been jailed unnecessarily and were now released to enjoy their freedom with whatever they wanted to do. He often asked me about what I thought this subject, expecting me to agree with him that they had to make money somehow to survive. I told him exactly what he wanted to hear. Everybody needs to do something to earn their money. Without realizing my psychological assessment of the situation, responding according to his needs, pleased him immensely. He was very happy, saying, "Aha, this is my professore." Despite everything, I remained a mystery man to him. Finally, he purchased one half of a house in East St. Kilda, originally belonging to a Jewish family, at number 1, 315 Orong Road, on the corner of Dean's Avenue. It was built in a Blue Belt area and was a great investment property, an old Victorian double-brick building. When questioned, he told others that he was buying it for his sister and brother-in-law when they decided to settle in Australia. But to me, he constantly said that it was just for me, and closer to his address in Caulfield. This was occurring during a time of desperation on my part. It was indeed a time I wished nobody within the human race would suffer. A time of having no food after paying all my expenses while living at number 2, 40 Lewis Street in Springvale. This situation was unfortunately forced upon me whilst also attending a business course at the Holmesglen Institute of TAFE, as on 29th of May, 1997, under a NEIS coordinator, Mr. Len Alabaster, who was in opposition to my idea of producing fractal movies, especially after seeing a sample footage, which he shared with his family. He exclaimed that his wife had been seeing devils and other frightening characters in there. Possibly his religious ideals and viewpoints also interfered with his mindset, thus his apprehension in regard to his negative influence on the so-called authority, which was likely to grant funding for my business enterprise. I considered the whole affair as being naught else other than wasting time on empty promises and dreams. On the other hand, I was constantly encouraged by certain friends to accept Damon's generous offer for rehousing myself in East St. Kilda. Although extremely fatigued, feeling lost and vulnerable, I decided to try my luck, which had not been very friendly lately. Either it would work well, or I would need to rehouse myself. According to Joan, if I did not try it, I might blame myself forever, although I could no longer trust anybody after what I had experienced. Moving out from Springvale might provide me with an ever-needed and renewed hope to recreate myself. I moved in with my old furniture, bedding, and household goods, my wonderful red tabby, and all my memories. At first Damon did not want me to make any holes on the walls, but soon after he put hooks on them to hang my paintings and drawings. Seeing me pour a drink from a big bottle of Chivas Regal I had obtained while in the United States, he considered me extremely addicted to alcohol, like his brother-in-law. At this time he was making many enquiries, asking my assistance in furnishing an official letter from a psychologist's viewpoint on why a family reunion was important for his sister and family to migrate to Australia. They found accommodation nearby, while his sister looked for a sports-related training position, whereas his brother-in-law was to manage one of Damon's petrol stations. However, his sister was furious that the house in East St. Kilda was not occupied by her and her family, but by somebody like Suren, whom they did not know. There were times when Damon incessantly kept interrogating me if I was taking advantage of him, as they had no idea about my background, although enough had been said. Obviously, his own background did not leave any room for considering that I was an honest person. His limited thoughts were based upon his experience of being surrounded by people who made use of him, hence his forever doubting nature. As time went by, he appeared to calm down slightly. Unusually, Damon wanted to attend the lectures, as with Stanton Friedman, the nuclear physicist, at the Dallas Brooks Hall, and my lectures on discoveries in regard to early civilizations, the beginnings of current humanity, Sumerians, Mesopotamians, and the Hittites. I remember when I was lecturing at the Theosophical Society's auditorium, and there was a huge crowd of people, all wanting to hear me speak. Damon sat right in the front. Jemay, my other longtime friend, was seated behind him, and later told me discreetly that Damon was sapping my energies while I was on stage. Margaret had also attended that lecture, and had a little unpleasantness with Rosemary, using a few ungainly expletives at her. She was angry with women who stood between her and men she was interested in. Later, she asked her young female relative to visit me at my East St. Kilda dwelling, and after discovering what looked like above-average wealth on my part, without knowing the details, pursued her interest in wanting to live with me and be married. She also hoped that I would purchase the rest of the house to accommodate her. She could not understand that this was nothing more than an unfulfillable dream. She started calling me day and night again, pestering about why I chose to accommodate Rosemary instead. For, after all, she was blooming English. She hoped, as she declared, that I would hate the English, just like some of the Irish did. Soon after my visit to Sydney and meeting her over an evening meal at a quality restaurant, she asked me to become her attorney when she went to the States to see her nursing sister and mother, who were now living there. She kept exclaiming that my eyes looked like the famed Indian guru Sai Baba's, and was convinced that we shared the same spiritual advancement. Obviously, she was encouraged to love Sai Baba unconditionally, interpreting it as being in love with him. Since she could never live with him, it became too much to contend with. Needing to make a clean break from it all, for it was very likely to develop into yet another unpleasantness, I told her that this issue was no more than a bunch of lies, and I did not want to have anything to do with this any more. She was very disappointed. She still insisted that I had encouraged her to leave her profession as a teacher at the high school in Sydney, where she was going to be forced into medical redundancy, and that I was apparently going to look after her in marriage. Although she was not going to let go so easily, she said, "All right, this is all bullshit. But when are we going to meet, and when do you think we should get married?" Now I had yet another dilemma to deal with. I needed to be able to generate sufficient income to pay my new expenses. Damon, however, was completely against my applying for any type of government assistance, for he wanted to have nothing to do with the authority, and suggested he was going to pay me wages if we started a meditation group in my then dwelling for his associates, promising that this way he was going to make me very, very rich, beyond my wildest dreams. But the excessive pressure from his sister was growing also. Soon after, he was questioning me whether I had any hidden agendas, and was bitterly opposed to my suggestion of earning money as a wedding photographer and videographer, demanding that I should concentrate only on spiritual things. Later, he registered our association, as he suggested, when we were in Egypt and Peru, as a business venture. We were to name this new company Ethereal Communications. I was unsure what the nature of its operations was going to be. Since he believed that people listened to only successful people, we had to succeed in this supposedly very intently spiritual enterprise by me becoming his personal channeler with the spirit world and his private psychic. The idea turned me off altogether from his dreamt-of business venture. As a human being, let alone as a psychologist, I could not see me performing something like this as a business partner with him, and it did not appeal to me. I believe he was knowledgeable of those so-called psychics who derived a good income by conducting cold reading and calling it spirit communication. He expected me to go into deep trance and let the spirits talk through me, without realizing that my unconscious mind could create stories he wanted to hear, and I would have no recollection of what was being relayed. He declared he did not want to waste time and money on trivial hobbies like videography or photography, even though it was my own funds. Obviously, he did not have any idea that such endeavors related to weddings could be very profitable. So it seemed I dared not do anything else other than spiritual things, having no hobbies, and never apply for any financial assistance when I did not have enough income, because he preferred not to risk having anything to do with the authorities, but I was generously allowed to do paintings, invent mind control devices, and conduct meditation classes for the elite group of his associates. It gave the impression that I was imprisoned against my will, and the whole situation started to look more and more like being sucked into a form of fraternity of an undesirable kind. I will tell you more in a while. Years later, in October 2014, while I was sharing a dwelling in Frankston with my friend Rosemary, we were curious to see the news coverage about Jehovah's Witnesses International Assembly at Etihad Stadium in Melbourne. I knew that my ex-wife would also be there, for as a dedicated witness, she could not miss any such occasion before the expected end. I did not hear from Claude, and assumed that he was accommodating his mother at his home. Remember, she would be extremely disturbed if he talked to his father, who she hated bitterly. After she had returned to Perth, he invited me to dinner, for he had apparently missed his dad. However, when he sent a text message to his mother, she was, as expected, very upset, writing immediately about her disgust regarding him talking with a man who spoke to spirits. He was troubled by this and demanded his mother apologize. Unfortunately, this carried an element of disrespect. Speaking of Jehovah's Witnesses, one specific observation on my part over the years clearly showed me that they were the type of people who never desired their members to think for themselves, applying psychological manipulation. One is led to believe that all exterior thoughts experienced are generated by an evil force to stop them from worshipping Jehovah, even leading one to question his authority. One is never encouraged to question their allegedly God-chosen organization. The witnesses enslaved to their so-called theocratic governing body are guided to only study the wisdom selectively chosen and prepared by members of Bethel in the U.S. If they tell you to jump, you are expected to ask, how high? Since the days of their founders, you are only encouraged to study what they see fit. You dare not think outside the square, adhering only to the study of the Holy Scriptures as they interpret. Some of the principles therein are always presented as being reserved to Jehovah's Witnesses and not practiced by the pagan Christians and all other belief systems in the world. Indeed, they have created a government within their own self-structured system of operations, wherein the entire world of humanity is judged as a negative entity from which they are separated. God's love is presented under a completely different light, as if they are the only beholders of that love and truth, denying all the good deeds other benevolent organizations do. Consider the Salvation Army and others. Jehovah's Witnesses entrap all their adherers to the Watchtower Society completely under a spell never to search into knowledge freely available to everyone through current trends of communication, like the Internet or other social media, for fear of finding something new and different, perhaps even for fear of their actual beginnings being discovered. Such discoveries are considered as temptations from Satan the devil, and you are emphatically discouraged from finding out the real truth. That is also why they label them as the devil's tools, and therefore evil, placed in front of your eyes to subject you to lies, to turn you away from the truth as presented under the banner of their governing body. Christ has also gained a different character under Jehovah's Witness teachings, not necessarily as the Bible explains. The Bible was written by men of great intelligence and imagination centuries ago. Jehovah's Witnesses do not want you to question the Spirit, never attempting to seek wisdom outside their teachings, certainly undermining your intelligence, your capacity to think, and the years of study you might have had. Your profession and position within society has no value as far as they are concerned, for as they endlessly preach, you simply need to obey and believe in what they teach you through their book publishing company, the Watchtower and Truck Society, allegedly the only illumined organization of God, without question. They do all the thinking for you. Your entire life, the way you eat and drink, lie down and sleep, your body and your thoughts are controlled. Your sex life in the bedroom also needs to be supervised. If you commit adultery, you will either be disciplined or disfellowshipped. It gets even better, and anal or oral sex will only attract theocratic advice, but will not attract shunning or disfellowshipment, unlike the greatest sin of questioning the Spirit. And the list goes on, which their congregations usually have no idea about. Remember, whatever is not included in their Bible does not count. You are separated in every conceivable way from almost all aspects of society. If you notice, even all Jehovah's Witness children at school are separated from activities approved by the education authorities. They are never encouraged to share them, which would prepare them for life. When examining their secretive activities regarding child abuse cases, they keep it hidden at all costs in order to keep their name unblemished, thereby keeping their children isolated. In fact, if you are a member of their organization, you will never be encouraged to excel or gain financial freedom adhering to the moral codes of human society you are part of. Everything is considered as a threat against your allegedly God-approved survival after Armageddon, the end of the world, which was predicted to occur in 1914, but that year was conveniently changed to signify the beginning of Christ's invisible rulership. After all, he was the everlasting King, who was no other than Archangel Michael, according to Jehovah's Witness teachings. Have they also been psychically told about it? One wonders. But as their governing body now declares, they are not inspired of God. As one discovers through research, In the early beginnings of their organization, one is informed that they were heavily involved in spiritual seances and Freemasonry. Why is their governing body discouraging members from finding out the real truth about themselves? Perhaps they should visit the grave of their founder near the Masonic Lodge, close to their headquarters, for it is a pyramid with Freemasonry emblems carved on it. In fact, if familiar, reading Masonry literature is like reading Jehovah's Witness publications, which replicate the principles presented therein with their own twist. They would only deny the fact that their organization is an apostate version of that which they diligently preach against. All those international assemblies, which cost millions of dollars to stage, are to encourage you to attend and discover the alleged unity and brotherhood they claim to represent as the real characteristics of Jehovah's Witnesses. Even though it is a lie, when it is presented in a tantalizing manner, it may become your truth, for it was spoken of by the faithful elect. You are invited to attend the well-staged and endlessly repeated lectures, bypassing your own personal interests. You are now under their hypnotic conditioning. For a moment of bliss, when the light turns on, you are sucked in, probably symbolizing your dedication to Jehovah through staged baptism ceremonies after an extensive study of the Bible with them. A misconstrued concept becomes your truth after endlessly being repeated. There are cults which are devoted to Satan worship, and the witnesses actually identify their God with a name which is also used as the divine name of one of the devils. Those who follow the Hebrew Bible never use the name. Tetragrammaton, YHYH, Yahweh, in the Old Testament, which is so holy that it should never be uttered by any man. The Hebrew Bible utilizes Adonai Elohim instead, although the holy name is included in the scriptures. As I have already made mention of my previous experiences, I also had my share of the witnesses, recalling memories of my early teenage years. When I was introduced to them by one of my cousins, they all presented themselves as being the most polite, caring, and joyful to be around type of people. When one showed any interest in getting to know them better, there were more smiles and an obvious increase in their friendliness, opening their doors wide to the curious seeker to study the Bible with them. I found myself befriended with one of their elders and his close associates while in Ankara. They explained their stories in a tantalizing manner, using some US-produced books like Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and their Watchtower magazines, which did not have any covers. As I have already mentioned in more detail, they were translated into Turkish and printed on extremely thin rice paper. They were sent out from all corners of the world by other witnesses to those living in Turkey. Such literature was considered as propaganda material for missionary work, and activities of this nature were strictly forbidden under Turkish law. Any type of missionary work from a Christian background was severely punishable, as it still is, according to information. Interestingly, the country boasts of being a true democratic nation. One wonders if they are still following the guidelines originally introduced by their great leader, Atatürk. Jehovah's Witnesses were operating undercover when I was introduced to them. They were meeting at each other's homes, as if visiting friends, ever ready to pretend they were just having a family gathering when the police raided their homes. I also experienced such a raid and saw how people were treated like criminals, their ministering elder taken into custody and later jailed for a short period of time. All this was rather interesting to a young man Besides, I was now amongst people who accepted me as their friend, and was not ridiculed because of the racial background I belonged to, or my outlandish name and looks. However, by observation alone, it was very unusual to see the witnesses living in fear, exercising caution. On the other hand, in Turkey, I was a member of a minority group of people belonging to a different race, completely unwanted, disliked, and rejected by Turkish society. The teachings of witnesses consisted of moral codes as prescribed in their Bible, the highly emphasized importance of seeking Jehovah's kingdom, and the establishment of the governing body, starting with their founders, Charles Taze Russell, and all their presidents who acted similarly to the Pope, like Rutherford, a retired lawyer who later declared himself a judge. We were incessantly warned about the year 1975 as most definitely being the end of our days on earth. We were therefore discouraged from undertaking any study in academia, start a business, or a family before Armageddon. But as per my nature, I desired to do things differently. Sometimes I was told by friends and relations that I seemed to do the opposite of everything. However, I now understand that this characteristic of mine was extremely beneficial for my developing personality. During those days, my staying in Ankara was becoming increasingly unpleasant, while also intolerably unacceptable to the native population. I was determined to remain different. Their educational system and other authorities presented complete opposition to anybody belonging to a minority race surviving amongst them, and all opportunities were denied to excel in any field, let alone academically. There are many examples of this, and I do not wish to include them here, for much has already been said. The truth of the matter is that if one wanted to do anything worthwhile in Turkey, one had to pretend to live a life like the native citizens of the country by changing one's identity, name, and religion. Although Turkey proclaims itself to be a thoroughly democratic country, allowing freedom of speech and belief systems, but different rules seem to apply for all human rights-related issues. At this point, I intend to make a reasonably short resume of my story. However, if you desire, you may simply discard this segment and go to the next chapter. Remember, I was befriended with a small number of people who initially accepted me as a human being. Some were from the same background as me, and others had overseas connections. It was when the light was turned on that I began to search into ways of escaping from the everlasting ridicule and bullying tactics by traveling into another country, never to return back. Although I have written a more detailed account in this regard, I feel the need to make mention of it briefly here before concluding. The country I was staying in at the time did not accept me or my parents as worthy human beings, for we were still bitterly hated since the war years. I needed to make my way out of this into a more tolerant, accepting, and freedom-loving community where there was no discrimination. In fact, anywhere would do. All I wanted to do was to work doing a suitable job while studying at one of the European universities. That would give me a chance to learn other languages. My father often recited his friend Martin's words, that a language was like a single man, but that several languages were like a few people, thereby expanding one's horizons. The opportunity I ardently desired arose when a married couple from Germany came to Turkey, visiting my friends who were Jehovah's Witnesses. I suppose, feeling as though I had fallen into a bottomless pit, I grasped that opportunity and started inquiring about my chances of getting away from Turkey, finding accommodation, part-time employment, and entering the education system elsewhere. Anybody who had fallen into the mire would even grab hold on the sharpest blade to get out of danger. I was not exaggerating my situation, and seeing many others in a similar predicament left me no choice. At first, all my dreams in this regard appeared impossible, but soon after I was invited to go to Germany on a one-way ticket, which the German couple provided for me to repay later. They offered me accommodation and even found me a job. From then on, many things became more interesting. However, shortly before my journey, the Turkish military invited me for conscription service, as they did with all young men around my age. Since they discovered that I was intending to study in Europe, they prepared their report accordingly, so that when I returned I could continue with a short conscription service. After all those interviews and intolerable medical exams, I was most definitely unwilling to return. Here was a wonderful opportunity and a great plan, but the issues I had to deal with in regard to my supposed involvement with Jehovah's Witnesses were going to present a few unwelcome challenges. I hoped one could put up or deal with it somehow without realizing their potentials and true nature of operations. It was also very hard for my mother to lose me for a while, but as she declared, it was much better for me to get away and become somebody in the near future. Hopefully, I have not disappointed her. However, the idea of leaving her all alone with my father and brother was very difficult to swallow. When living in Germany, I discovered that my so-called friends were overly keen to control my every move and every thought under very strict rules and regulations based upon Jehovah's Witness dictates. Due to me being very friendly with all others, no matter what background they belonged to or what they believed in, those witness friends have seen me as a baptized member of their organization without question. For after all, genuinely friendly and helpful people can only be Jehovah's Witnesses. And remember, the outside world is under the control of the great serpent, the devil, is it not? The witnesses are encouraged to think in those terms, bypassing the reality of good and charitable people around the globe. Obviously, members of the organization in Ankara had considered me as one of theirs, and my supposed dedication to their faith was never questioned. I could never declare my truth to them, for I was never given any opportunity to speak, and so I kept playing my secret role. It was hard for me, who was studying and discovering more about the real truth in regard to medicine and workings of the human mind, while being forced into a pretense of being one of the Jehovah's Witness slaves. My ex-wife, who was my then girlfriend, whom I dearly loved, was not a baptized member of their religious order when we first met, but she was studying the Bible with them. In my early days in Germany, none of them wanted to know about my deepest desire to continue with my education after successfully passing a number of academic exams to be accepted by one of their highly reputable universities. I knew that in Ankara I would never be recognized or given any chance to advance with my family background. I had a huge dilemma. I could never explain to my friends at whose dwelling I was housed that what they thought in regard to my full-time employment was in reality part-time job, and most of my days were spent studying for my university degrees. Remember, almost all witnesses are thoroughly against any type of academic achievement on this side of Armageddon. A certain amount of time was also needed to spend with them, allegedly studying their Bible, attending their regular weekend meetings, and listening to long, boring talks presented in their kingdom halls. A while later, my witness friends, who originated from East Germany, the country being divided into East and West at the time, migrated to southernmost state of Tasmania, Australia. The girl I loved and I were going out more often. I was glad that I had not started any relationship with Sybil, the girl the Strobachs had previously introduced me to. Sybil was inflicted with extreme restrictions by her witness parents, who disciplined her harshly. Due to this, she developed psychiatric abnormalities and later committed suicide by hanging herself. Her extremely strict and overly fanatical parents blamed the psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and everybody involved in her treatment. They classified as demonic practices. My friends at whose dwelling I was housed believed that if I could be somehow interested in marrying this girl, her problems would be eased, for they were able to see how those Jehovah's Witness parents' dogmatic practices were dangerous and mentally harming their daughter. Even then, the nervous breakdowns many witnesses experience in their lives were clearly evident. Sybil's problem was most certainly caused by the Jehovah's Witness lifestyle. However, being an inexperienced young man, I was in love with the other girl I met at one of their gatherings, and did not want to have anything to do with Sybil. Whenever I wanted to see the Witness brothers my future wife was studying the Bible with, they strictly barred me from entering. I was stunned, but did not overly concern myself, yet was very much surprised about her eagerness to talk about nothing else other than the truth she learned from those brothers. It was so bad that one could not speak about anything else other than the Bible. I was blind to the warning signals about what could happen in the near future. Soon after, she was completely absorbed into their truth and turned against the entire world, just like all other witnesses are. She could no longer see anything nice in the world, and never wanted to participate in any of the world's activities, for they were deemed to be demonic and under control of the all-powerful devil. We never celebrated anything or wished well to anybody for Christmas, New Year, or birthdays. I drifted into an oblivion, hoping that things might improve, and one could discover new interests and hobbies. We could never talk about anything else other than the kingdom of Jehovah, the New World Order, Armageddon, and the wickedness of the world. To be truly happy with her, I had to bypass all my interests in medicine, music, astronomy, and photography whenever I was with her. I endured it all for love's sake. Eventually we got married with great expectations. All my other friends and even my parents were replaced by members of Jehovah's Witnesses with their biased viewpoints about the world and everything in it, education and art. I, on the other hand, became more and more a spiritually secluded, internalized man. During this period of my life, I could only enjoy things like music discreetly, using a pair of headphones, although that was also considered as an intrusion, stopping us from forever thinking about nothing else other than God's kingdom and house-to-house preaching activities. I went along with it, primarily to please my wife, while still cautiously and discreetly conducting my academic studies. Like her many friends, she forever advised me that I should only be concerned in looking after my family, doing simple laboring jobs, and dedicating my entire life to serving Jehovah as dictated by their headquarters in Brooklyn. We attended a number of international and district assemblies in different venues, different cities, and different parts of Europe. However, wherever we have been was of no value, for we have not seen anything other than attending the large stadiums hired by their organization for vast sums of money. These were also venues where new students who had learned all about the Bible, as interpreted by the witnesses, were encouraged to symbolize their dedication to Jehovah through public baptism ceremonies. We were subjected to listening to everlastingly repeated concepts and principles as presented in their teachings by members of their governing body. Long before the Strobachs decided to migrate to Australia, An occasion which I told you about earlier still amazes me. I am going to repeat myself just for the fun of it. You may either choose to laugh at it or prefer to cry over it. It really is up to you. One night after midnight, being unable to sleep and needing to prepare for an important exam at the university, I had some of my textbooks on the table, and one particular book carried a detailed image of a human skull on its front cover. I had borrowed that book, for it contained some medical information clearly. Close to 2 in the morning, my friend's wife, staring through the slightly ajar door, as I had not closed it properly, shouted, "Oh my God, it's the devil's practice!" Shocked, I did not know how to react to her outburst, and thought that Jehovah's Witnesses were more in control with their Bible-based wisdom. During the night, apparently some demonic activity was taking place in their room, so that they could not sleep properly. On top of that, her husband was levitating closer to the ceiling. When she noticed the chink of light coming from my room, on seeing supposedly devil's books, she was convinced that I was doing evil deeds, and probably black art, like my mother, the witch, practicing by reading coffee cups and tea leaves. That was why they were burning everything, including all her letters and large gifts she sent me, so I never had a chance to see them. When questioning them about their unwarranted activities, they reacted that all those items turned into human skeletal parts after burning. I started to contemplate how superstitious Jehovah's Witnesses were, always living in absolute fear in case the all-powerful devil influenced their minds. They never allowed me to have any connection with the outside world, introducing me only to those brothers they associated with. On the other hand, I had neither any fun time with my wife, nor did we have any entertainment, for she was so conditioned right from the beginning never to allow any kind of joy in her life, in case Satan the devil would keep us away from only thinking about the kingdom of God shortly before the end times. Still a little naive, interested in studying and making my new experience of being married work for us, I simply drifted into a fantasy world without sharing in the witness faith, although kept asking very intriguing questions. Too many questions were not seen as something positive by their elders, and I was often advised not to question the spirit. Obviously, they knew nothing. Occasionally I took myself to the movies, attended art exhibitions and concerts whenever I had time from study and work, without telling anything to my wife or the witnesses, because I did not desire to be endlessly reminded that I might be sinning against their godly principles. I needed to tell her little white lies in order to survive her endless criticism and preaching. In the beginning, she envisaged us being a very happy couple who dedicated their entire lives to Jehovah's service. Although I shared some of their activities, like going house to house for the sake of peace, I could not bend myself to preach like she did, for my heart was never in it. I never considered myself as being a dedicated servant to their society. I was truly a loner. Even her parents, who were not members of the Witnesses, did not like me much because of my ethnicity. I was simply tolerated. The first baby we had in our family was deliberately alienated against me, and they never realized that it was going to have a lasting effect on her personality. After my graduation, and upon the German government deeming my political asylum to be no longer necessary, we applied to migrate to Australia. Magda was overly excited about the prospect of dedicating her life in a pioneering service to Jehovah's organization there. For a while, I had very difficult times after our arrival in Australia, due to the non-existence of suitable employment according to my academic qualifications. But she, like the other witnesses, was happy for me to do small unsatisfying laboring or cleaning jobs, just to look after my family, but primarily Jehovah's interests. Having one's own house or investment property was not important as long as we served God and His kingdom. Later, we had 2 more children while in Melbourne, and during that time I was occupied with more suitable employment related to my academic background, lecturing. I developed more sophisticated hobbies and interests in music, composing, painting, holding art exhibitions, and performing arts. I was involved in social clubs, astronomy, science, and even UFO research, but all those activities, just like everything else, were considered as the devil's tools to keep us away from serving kingdom interests before Armageddon, and I was forever advised and chastised for it by all the witnesses, and more often by my nagging wife. The more opposition they showed against the evil practices of other religious belief systems, including spiritualism and theosophy, I wanted to know how they functioned. I elected to study those belief systems discreetly, out of curiosity, while also needing to distance myself from all organized and myth-based ideals, without prejudice, for they had their own truths. For the sake of peace and to please my wife, I kept playing the role of a dedicated husband, although it was not good enough for the witnesses, for apparently I had to love Jehovah more than my children and wife. I had to become a more dedicated slave to Jehovah. That did not sit well with me. When Jehovah's Witnesses increased their pressure on me, I openly started to act completely against their will. Now, although I was at least in appearance a very dedicated minister amongst them, I became a man who allegedly practiced evil seances and black magic due to my association with worldly people who allegedly worshipped the devil. It was therefore very apt to explore what they hated most. I began a campaign of the mildest kind and started pretending as if I was really practicing magic, like that performed on stage. As it came to pass, I was subjected to the Judicial Committee of Jehovah's Witness elders, questioning me in regard to those evil practices I was supposedly engaged in, and endlessly questioning the spirit, apart from my alleged sex addiction outside marriage. I found this opportunity very useful to finally tell them what I had been prevented from saying for many years. As a result, they declared what my well-conditioned wife was itching to see happen. It was also when she had been told a number of lies by a couple of elderly fanatics after they had seen me talking to a black African girl in the tram. However, I did not know her. She was simply asking me for directions. Magda did not communicate with me for many days, although she knew deep down that I was not engaged in extramarital affairs. She knew that I had been painting portraits of people, including females, as I did with her. She knew that I had a wide-reaching interest in performing arts and singing, although she did not appreciate it under the direction of the witnesses. When she told me we had very little in common and rejected me, I spent a lot of time walking the empty streets at night until the early hours of the morning before going to my office. I was utterly devastated and miserable, and the only time I went home was when I gave her the money she needed for the upkeep of the family. I was in limbo. Sometimes I could not properly concentrate at work, and took days off. I was unable to generate enough income to support her, and yet I often starved myself in order to give her whatever monies I had. She had no appreciation for anything, as she preferred to be just an active Jehovah's Witness, because the end was nigh. She was unable to support me in any venture. She did not have any time for that. I was in dire need of moral support. When we had an opportunity to talk about our differences, she declared that those Jehovah's Witness sisters would never tell lies, and what they told her had to be right about that black African girlfriend. She explained that since I was not in the truth, this marriage, which needed to function only under the dictates of God's organization, could not last. I was now an outsider, and anybody associating with a great sinner like me would be severely punished and excommunicated, for Jehovah was righteous. My wife was like a robot, completely controlled by Jehovah's Witnesses, and we certainly had nothing in common. When she allegedly went to Hobart, supposedly visiting her friends, I had an opportunity to draw and paint yet another portrait of a girl, this time at my place, and my daughters were fascinated to watch me. But when Magda suddenly stormed in with one of her elder brothers, she shouted, "See this, brother? Those sisters were right. He's fornicating with a young whore. Who knows? She probably slept in my bed." Everybody was in great shock. The girls were crying and hiding behind the chairs. Alas, one cannot easily forget how she yelled, commanding them to go with their mother and the brother she came with. They insisted, sobbing, that they were staying with their dad. She raised her voice even further, telling them that they could rot in hell like their father and stay with him. Grabbing our young son by the arm, shouted at him, "You will come with Mommy." He bitterly cried, wanting to stay with his daddy. The children were terribly shaken, and I can never forget how my son was dragged out roughly. Months later, when we finally met at the family court, the whole room was filled with Jehovah's Witnesses, praying, waiting for my demise, while supporting their faithful sister. And when full custody of all 3 children was granted to me, she threw herself on the floor, shouting, "He is the evil one. He broke our family, and he committed adultery." Later the court hearing ended, with the young boy's custody being granted to her, with many rules and regulations put in place. One can only imagine what trauma the children were subjected to. I was extremely saddened for my son, knowing that he was going to be indoctrinated into the Jehovah's Witness cult, unable to discover what life existed outside their most isolated and certainly ill-fated organization. He would be conditioned to hate the world and everything in it, believing that the whole world was given to the all-powerful Satan, and his father was part of that wicked world, which was to end soon, when Armageddon happened. For many years I looked after my children on my own, and became both parents. But when the time came and they needed their mother's help and advice about their private issues, they were told simply to ask their dad, for he had their custody. She had regular access to them, although the girls did not enjoy spending time with her, for they were subjected to boring witness activities, and constantly bombarded that people who were not in the truth, like Jehovah's Witnesses and their faithful mother, could only be wicked and evil, and that all-loving God, Jehovah, was going to destroy them during Armageddon. They were well conditioned to hate the so-called evildoers, including those talking to the spirits, saluting the flag, singing the national anthem, celebrating Christmas and birthdays like their dad. Gradually their young minds became very confused about what to believe. They started telling many untruths, supposedly to please me and their mother. Everything I did or said was seen as evil. For example, my being a practicing psychologist and lecturer was considered as if I was playing devil's games, influencing people's minds with wicked thoughts, and because only Jehovah's Witnesses spoke the truth, evil and disfellowshipped men like their father could only tell lies. Their mother believed every story the girls invented and would never listen to the real truth, and knowing how naive she was, they created even more to please her. My daughters' minds were now completely altered. Every good deed from my side and personal sacrifices have been conveniently forgotten. I gave them my time and my all, although I knew that they did not appreciate me. They were trying to play their mother against me and me against her, and in their early to mid-teens, completely confused about their own lives and partially under peer pressure, they began rebelling against me. I was convinced that such behavior immensely pleased Magda. Now they were campaigning against me and creating more stories as if I was involved in the evil practices of witches and warlocks, conjuring up evil spirits and casting evil spells just to please their mother. However, I know that Jehovah's Witnesses, hearing such stories and character references against me, were thrilled to know that their faithful sister was free from such a terrible and allegedly evil man. There came a time when I felt it necessary to send my first daughter to her mother to stay with her for a while, as I have spoken about in more detail. She took that as if I had kicked her out of home, and when she went to her mom's, she attacked her with a pair of scissors. Soon after, Birgit decided to leave while I was at work. But before leaving, poured petrol over my belongings, wanting to burn everything that was mine. Fortunately, she was not successful. I honestly believe that she did so on advice from either her mother or the other Jehovah's Witnesses, for they all believe that by fire they could eliminate evil influences. Years later, in early 1995, I met Birgit accidentally at one of the department stores in Melbourne. Now, grown-up young lady, approaching with one of her other friends, she asked me why I chose the ways of the wicked world. Advising me, she said that if I could accept the truth and know that Jehovah was God and the heavenly kingdom was soon to rule the world after Armageddon, perhaps our family could live together again. Without knowing anything about the circumstances and not baptized in their faith, she was advising me just the way her mother had instructed her. In the circumstances, if I would consider joining such a religious order of absolute evil, bypassing everything I had experienced with Jehovah's Witnesses, I would be one of the greatest fools in the world. Their so-called Bible prophecies, presented as the absolute truth, have been proved to be completely false. It is so ironic to hear them remind us of the false prophets. What about them? Later still, my son, whom I had not seen for many years, was trying to lecture me about the kingdom of God, whilst blaming me for having chosen to be a part of the wicked world during a chance meeting at his sister's. He even told me how uncomfortable he felt calling me Dad, for I was disfellowshipped and not in the truth. Can one imagine how devastating and how sad it was for a father to discover such rejection? But I knew that he was not talking to me as he really felt deep down. I knew that his mother, bent to the will of the Jehovah's Witness organization, was talking through him, declaring her endless hatred, learned faithfully from the teachings she was subjected to. Neither could I blame her for being blindly led into darkness by superstitious, wicked, and one-track-minded people, in reality following what they bitterly opposed. My wife constantly preached to me about the unquestionable abilities Satan the devil had, and could easily put untruthful ideas in our minds, making us believe in wicked lies. Could that same Satan, therefore, also put those ideas in the witnesses' minds to hate the world, making them believe that it was controlled by him after God had endorsed it? Why then, according to the Bible, did this same God, who loved the world, gave his only begotten Son? Here we discover that God loves the world, yet he allows Satan to rule over it. In reality, if we are so righteous in the religious sense, we should love the world, just like our Father God loves it. Why should anyone hate it? Remember also that anyone who is disfellowshipped is bitterly hated, and shunned by the witnesses, who consider them as non-existing, for they belong to the wicked world. This logic is man-made, like any other dogma, not originating from supreme mind of a God. By being completely biased, Jehovah's Witnesses prefer to block their ears to the real truth, and therefore my wonderful son could not understand me, not even wanting to, when I tried to explain a few truths to him. I could only hope that he would one day wake up to see the reality for himself. And so I told him that I would never get into a religion of utter darkness after all my experiences with them. I also reminded him that if I did not interfere with the Jehovah's Witness decision not to treat Margaret when for her bleeding after she had suffered third-degree burns when she was very young, she would not be with us today, although her mother would literally see her die. However, he looked at me blankly, obviously not following what I was saying. No parent should watch their child die when there is a cure. Most ancient and archaic religious cultist practices like this are not part of my way of living. Despite all that, my daughter added, "As Mom said, we have to prove our faith and devotion to Jehovah by obeying the orders given to us if we want to live forever and never experience death, unlike the rest of the wicked world. Blood transfusion is never allowed, for it is allegedly is a great sin according to Jehovah's Witness interpretation of the Bible. They consider the scriptural text Leviticus chapter 17, verses 13 and 14 to support their claims. Anybody who does not obey the governing body and lets doctors transfuse blood to save a life is bound to face Jehovah's condemnation through the final say of the judicial committee, resulting in disfellowshipment and shunning. Later, Margaret demanded that I visit one of the local kingdom halls, insisting that they were going to be very friendly towards me, for they had apparently changed a lot since the days when I was disfellowshipped. She obviously did not want to accept that they would simply ignore me as if I did not exist, but knowing what I knew, and just to satisfy her curiosity, as I told you in more detail before, I went along with it. Seated next to my daughter, every witness gathered therein came specifically to greet her, but not one single person attempted to recognize my presence. In fact, I was invisible to them. After that special gathering, she completely ignored me, despite my efforts, reminding her that they would never talk or recognize me as a human being. It was exactly how I expected it to be. She insisted that if I got down on my knees and begged for Jehovah's forgiveness, only then, and after a period of further Bible studies with our dear brothers, would I be accepted. She was demanding the impossible. All I knew was that even if I had a heart attack and died, they would not be stirred, for I was the rejected of their alleged God. By their nature, the witnesses take you away from your circle of friends with the excuse of them belonging to the wicked world, replacing your entire associations with their own kind. If you decide to leave them or do something wrong in their eyes, and they excommunicate you, you may find yourself completely abandoned, as all your friends, the witnesses, leave you. You are now forced to seek forgiveness of Jehovah for your wicked sins, or you may become just another nervous wreck, perhaps even driven to commit suicide, but they would still insist that it was your own doing. The most surprising issue here is that a few criminally minded or pedophiles are continually accepted to be part of their organization due to their supposed regret of their undesirable actions, which are swept under the carpet, while people who apparently questioned the Spirit are completely shunned. Has this situation taught my daughter the reality of how archaic and cruel the Jehovah's Witnesses, allegedly the chosen of God, are? The fact is that they have utterly destroyed my family, as with thousands of other families and individuals throughout the years, as well as painting my reputation with the darkest black. One wonders how happy they are about their achievements. Was it not them preaching what God put together, let no man put asunder? Can they see anything beautiful in the world at all? Can they only see the negative in everything? As we observe in the current state of human nature, we see the good and bad side of everyday living. Does one need to add more to the negativity we must needlessly face in our lives? Would it not be far better to surround the world with love and light without concentrating on all the negative aspects of life? Maybe Jehovah's Witnesses should start cleaning their front yard first before complaining about their neighbors. If we, as a civilized human society, consider the existence of wicked and evil people around our world, we should also include such cults as Jehovah's Witnesses. They are one of the most fanatical and dangerous group of humans, with their control mechanisms from within their headquarters they call God's spirit-guided governing body. Examine their history without ignoring the real truth, and then consider the tragic stories of people who had unique experiences whilst adhering to their faith, rejected, excommunicated, ignored, judged as wrongdoers and sinners. After befriending with them, and when people decide to leave their organization, or are removed by decree of their so-called judicial committee for their supposed transgressions of questioning the Spirit, many are rendered lonely, miserable, and suicidal. Psychological studies show that such mental disorders are more common amongst Jehovah's Witnesses. Remember, we are living in a world where there are conflicts created by men, and people kill each other either by their swords or word of mouth. Are supposedly peace-loving witnesses any different? Is it a godly practice to destroy others? Jesus teaches us to love one another, yet many witnesses I met over the years claim that Jesus came not to bring peace, but the sword. One is urged to question if that is what they are practicing. Can one really consider the teachings of witnesses as equal to Christ's? When there can be no true peace and genuine love, but only the sword, as they claim, there can only be separations and violence. There can therefore neither be peace nor any goodness with Jehovah's Witnesses. They believe that Jesus is Archangel Michael, with a flaming sword in his right hand. If you are religiously inclined, you must know that they are the false prophets, not doing God's will, but rather that of the one who opposes all light.